episode of World Bigfoot Radio. Once again, we're going to have a really interesting guest here. And before we get to that, I'd like to remind you guys that if you do not have protection on the internet, I have partnered with ProXPN. Go check them out, man. If you guys don't like being spied on with everything that you're doing on the internet, you need VPN. Go get one. And these guys will give you 50% off if you use the promo code SAVE1975. Which is a huge savings, and a teeny portion of your payment will go to help support this channel. So if you get a VPN from ProXPN, you're helping support Bigfoot Central. Also, for those of you who have actually been so super ultra kind as to help this channel directly by donating to my PayPal, thank you very much. God bless you people. I really appreciate all of your help. You guys are keeping this show coming to you and allowing me to continue. I have a noted and famous author on here. He is the author of the book Genesis 6 Conspiracy. And this gentleman has basically taken every interesting conspiracy thing in history and tied them all together. So for you guys that wanted to have me do a conspiracy show again and talk about some of all these weird connections that are all over the place, this is the man. And I just talked to him here a minute before that we started recording, and he's actually willing to come back on the show, do more shows. So in the future, you will have a chance to get your questions to him. Just send them to me, and I'll ask them to him. But all that be as it may, let me invite on and very warm welcome.
Very much looking forward to the conversation today and hoping that we can bring some different information to the subject matter, and hopefully it'll raise the curiosity with the audience a little bit.
Yeah, this is sort of a different approach to the subject than usual, and one of the things that I'd like to get into first, and this of course is like huge on everybody that's interested in Bigfoot's radar, is what are they, where did they come from? And one of my questions for you is that we were just talking about this before we went on the air, the sort of accidental or maybe on purpose mistranslation part of the beginning of the Bible, which makes it seem like there was actually more than one major disaster. In other words, God created the earth, made it all complete. There was a big war in heaven. Angels came down, wrecked up the place. And then after that, they created giants, and then there was a big flood, wiped them out. So my question to you is, in between when God created the world and the angels came down and wrecked up the place, what did he create on it? In other words, did he make races of people that were similar to us but not us? Did he create the pre-Adamites, or do you think that the fallen angels did that?
Yeah, those are some very, 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 very good questions. And so when I start to get into this sort of aspect, understand there's not a whole lot that we can draw on in terms of specific sort of linked evidence. But what I can do is dissect what the Bible says about this time and then match that up with what prehistory says coming out of other religions and the other mythologies around the world. That I think we have to be careful with that term because, in the West, we call them mythology. And, if you say that to the Greeks or the Native Americans, they're going to say, no, that's our history. So
yeah, to them, it's religion. It's not folklore or mythology. It's
exactly. And so I want to be respectful of that to both sides, all sides of the argument, so we can start making some connections there, though. And what people don't realize, just as what you're saying, is that you can translate Genesis 1:1 to 1:2 two different ways. You can translate it with the standard dogma that that's when the earth was created, and then you have the 6 days of creation and then the final day. But when you get back into the Hebrew, and in some of the translations actually will have an anecdote that it doesn't say that, the earth was form and voidless. It'll have a footnote that says the other possible translation is that it became formless and void. And then that sort of changes everything, because now you have what I would call the renewal of the earth understanding, where just as in Psalms 104, it says, the earth is renewed. In paraphrasing this, he sends his spirit. And this is the same spirit that we see hovering over the earth at the start of this creation. And so if you actually had the earth becoming void, just as described in Isaiah 45, and this is a whole show, so I'm just going to just quickly wrap this up without getting into too many details. God doesn't create anything without a reason, or just sort of out of pride, or in vain, as it says. You take that back, and you're back into Tuhu and Guhu into Hebrew, which is talking about how the earth became void. And for me, this fits better when you have the angelic rebellion, or the God's rebellion, as you have that in other religions. And out of the outcome of this rebellion, you have a destruction of the earth, and then you have the renewal of the earth. And the people who lead these angels are the watchers. And this is very important to understand in terms of how this sort of comes downstream, is that these seraphim angels were called the watchers. And the seraphim angels, as it comes out of Isaiah 6, are fiery serpent angels. So now you get this correlation of all of these serpentine gods all around the earth, and you put wings on a serpent, you have a dragon. So this dragon and the serpent mythology are the ones who are going to produce the Nephilim in Genesis 6:1-4, that are going to totally corrupt and violate the world that's created after the renewal of the earth. And then there's another interesting thing we won't get into about how I look at how the creation of days 4 to 6 compare with the Eden account, and I can't reconcile them. And I don't believe the Bible is in contradiction in any way. So I'm not here to bash the Bible, because I'm a Christian and I believe everything that's written in the Bible. But I can't reconcile that. And so to me, it looks like there's two creations in there. And so now to come full circle, and just by the way, if anybody out there would want some documentation in terms of what I'm talking about in the Eden account versus days 4 to 6, and or in the beginning in Genesis 1:1-1:2, just get a hold of me through my website. There's an email on there, or through Facebook under Gary Wayne, and ask me, and I'll send you those documents. So
I'd also like to add in a quick note here, Gary. If anybody wants more information on the mistranslation at the beginning of the Bible, the tohu bohu thing that we just sort of bleeped right over, go back to the History of the Giants shows that I did, and Dave, the Deliverer, gives a very excellent explanation of this whole thing during one of those shows.
Terrific. Yeah, and it's important to know, so we need to be open for that. So within what is going on in these creation accounts is you have a creation of a number of beings that I call the creation of the Nephilim corruption. And this is not just understood that there were these seraphim angels who created these serpent-like beings that became the kings and usurped the kingships both before and then again after the flood. But also there are accounts of these gods either doing DNA manipulation in terms of how you want to understand it, let's say with the centaur creation in a cloud, which sounds like it's sort of off-world, and either with gods or aliens, however you want to take that. And or with sex with all of these other types of beings that are created that show up all over the world. And the interesting thing is about these, what I call corruptions and violations against the laws of creation, as the first book of Enoch would call it, is that they show up on every continent around the world, in all cultures, in all religions, except for Antarctica. And of course, who knows what we'll find down the road in Antarctica. So there's a commonality that goes back to all of these subjects. And the reason why, as a Christian, why I'm open to expanding that type of different types of creations that somehow have a similar sort of root is that I think most people are familiar with the flood story, where it says the whole earth was corrupt before God and the earth was filled with violence. And most people just sort of accept that this is the violence that they're talking about. And I would suggest that the whole earth became corrupt, just as what it says. It wasn't just violence. Everything is corrupt. And I would spread that to the genome for plants and the DNA and the types of beings that are on the earth. Because if you take that word back to Hebrew, it's 7843 shakaf. And what's interesting about that is it's got the word decay, ruin, batter, corrupt, and completely spoil or pervert, morally corrupt. It's got a lot of Hebrew applications. And when the whole world is that, there's more going on than just the violence. And we have the example of the Nephilim, who actually caused the flood, which is why their creation is in the beginning of the narrative of the flood story as part of the cause. And so when we understand that we have these hybrid beings that look like they're procreators, the seraphim, fiery serpent angels, who are also depicted as the kings in so many accounts around the world, we have to start to take notice that there was a large corruption that actually took place. And I know that's a very long answer.
That. You know, one thing that I've always noticed here, people that just sort of lightly brush over the subject, or they just read, you know, the Gen 6 and they go right over it. They don't read your book or anything. There was a thing on giants. Okay, no big deal. Let's see. Angels were mating with humans. They made giants. Got it. There's more to the story than that. And like you just referenced in the book of Enoch, it brings up the fact that they had defiled everything. They defiled the fish, they defiled the birds, they defiled the trees, they defiled the vegetables, they defiled the fruit. I don't think they're physically mating with all these things. I think they're talking about genetic manipulation, GMO technology, and which would also explain how all these chimeras came into creation, because if you can manipulate the DNA sequence on any kind of plant or animal, you can certainly create weird hybrids.
Yeah.
Which brings me to another question. I was wondering what your take on this would be. Do you think dinosaurs were GMO creations they made?
Well, again, that's why, you know, it's taken some time in terms of the two different possible creations and the renewal of the earth, and then also another gap. But I mean, when we look at archaeology and we look at science, I don't think they're completely so far off track that you know, when they're dating some of these dinosaur bones. And what we're learning is that these dinosaurs were very much reptilian, not only just reptilian, but also with feathers, right? So many of them were, and so we're getting closer and closer descriptions back to seraphim, who would have been the ones who were part of the creation, perhaps in the first earth, and or corrupted that creation in their likeness again, just as they were trying to do with the Nephilim in Genesis 6 after, in about the 6th generation after the creation or recreation of the earth. And I think, again, that's why I like to have that rebellion back before. I'm not dogmatic on it, and I can go either way, but it just seems to fit better, so that you have this whole world of reptilian type of beings after the ones who were probably ruling that world. It just makes more sense, and the descriptions and the parallels to them are just absolutely extraordinary.
Right, and one of the things I always thought about is if you've got these enormous giants, and they did, you know, what are they eating? They need a food source, and if you got GMO technology and you can create 100-ton reptiles running around, well, there's your cattle herd.
Yeah, so, which again is why I'm not too concerned whether or not the scientists have the dating wrong, and they are just before the flood, and they're part of the food source of the giants, because again, it makes sense. And these animals aren't the normal sized animals, right? Dinosaurs, for the most part, I mean, there's small ones as well, but for the most part, these are giant beings, which makes sense. So whatever they're doing to the DNA of that, in terms of the creation or the violation of that creation, it has a similar effect to what the Nephilim were, because when we're talking about giants, we're not talking about 7 feet tall or 8 feet tall. We're actually talking, you know, even 2,000 years after the flood, where you get almost 3,000 with Goliath. He is 6 cubits and a span, which on a standard 18-inch cubit would put him at 9 feet 9 inches. I would argue he is a royal bloodline. He's from Gath, and probably the king of Gath as a Hittite, as were all of the Avim, Saranim were Avim, Rephaim giants who were leading that city-state at the time and before. And so a royal cubit is arguably just under 21 inches or right at 21 inches, depending on who you're going to talk to. And that's going to take him from about 11 feet 1 to 11 feet 3 inches. And giants weren't thought to be just tall and slender. They're believed to have had a height to width ratio of 2 to 1 versus what the average human would be 3 to 1. So it would be incredibly broad and stocky. And then by that same sort of account, Og's bed, which was made of iron because wood wouldn't support his weight, is again using those two dynamics, and he's definitely a king, so of royal bloodline, so probably a royal cubit, but giving sort of both. You're going to get a height of him somewhere between 12 and 14 and a half feet, because his bed is going to be about 13 to 16 feet. And so again, we get that for a size. And we get an allegory in Amos where these giants were like the cedars of Lebanon. Now, it's a simile, so it's allegorical, so we can't take this as their exact size, because the giant cedars of Lebanon were the giant trees in the ancient world for building, yes, and they grew from 36 to 50 feet, correct, but it's a simile. So we don't know whether or not they're talking about Amorites, who are a diluted form of the giants and an offspring with Rephaim patriarch after the flood. I doubt whether they're 36 to 50 feet, but it gives you an idea that they're talking about them as giants. But the ones before the flood, in the first generation, we don't know how big they are. I think first book of Enoch, we can't really use that measurement. One translation, which is Aramaic, will have it at 300 cubits, which would put them like 450 feet tall. And the other translation, which is out of Giaz, which is the longer translation from Ethiopia, would have that as a measurement called L. And we really don't know what an L is. So again, I'm not sure I'd go so far to say that they were that big, but I think what most people in the field would agree on is before the flood, they were 20 to 40 feet tall. So if you're going to feed these animals, the larger the animal, which is the larger point, in this case dinosaurs or giant animals or bred animals to be larger in that period, would have to be there to sustain the population of these giants. Mm-hmm. Or eating humans.
Well, obviously they were doing that too. That's one thing that it mentions. Is in the days of Noah, it'll be at the end times, and they'll be eating and drinking and given in marriage. Well, what they're exactly talking about is eating flesh, drinking blood, and taking wives that may not necessarily want to be wives.
Everything that happened in the Noah's world, and people will say, well, how do you expand that as part of the end time signs? It's part of the end time signs. And B, the Bible doesn't use words haphazardly. And whether or not this is an English translation or you take it back to Greek, which is the New Testament. And when you look at that wording, it's the exact same wording when we get the age of Noah in Genesis, where he lives 950 years. It's 350 years after the flood and 600 years before the flood. And it actually says identically the days of Noah. So if you're a Christian like I am, you're going to believe in the accuracy of what Jesus is going to say in the accuracy of the Bible. And now it's reflecting everything that was going on both before and after the flood in the days of Noah, because that's a direct reference. And then everything comes into play, just as you say.
Yeah, I've been taken to task before by people on the dinosaur thing, going, well, why would they make, if I could see maybe they'd make like big, brontosaurus or something like that. Brachiosaurus, there's a big food animal. It can't really fight you back. Lots of meat, but why would they make like a Tyrannosaurus or something? And I'm like, well, look, if you're a 35-foot, really stocky giant, built like a Bigfoot, essentially, we'll get back to that. A T-Rex is 50 feet long and 20 foot tall. That's like a normal human having a hunting dog. It's not really a threat to you. It's probably good at defending your property and keeping the other giants from bugging you. But it's not going to be something like you have to worry about it eating you or anything like that. It's probably just like they had an attack dog.
Sure. And I have a real good analogy, because it could be that they wanted to hunt these things. Mm-hmm. People can pick who was bigger or whatever. And the analogy would be, because so much of this information is always hidden in plain sight with the entertainment. And in this case, if you go to a very similar version, which is the ancient alien mythos, which is just sort of lowers the God level down to very high, intelligent, developed aliens as opposed to gods or fallen angels, you have the Alien movie, which has this sort of almost Tyrannosaurus Rex looking type of individual from the head like, and then you have the amalgamation of this other race that hunts them. right? And they're like a giant being. And so generally when you bring those genres together, what they're telling us is that these monster type beings that were created for the giant ruling class to hunt and for entertainment and for food.
And I could see that. We were doing the same thing back in the Middle Ages. The kings would, have get-togethers with all the other elites, and they'd go out for big hunting trips and stuff. So it just makes sense they'd do it.
Yeah, and just as Nimrod, is known as the mighty hunter and mighty warrior, they went sort of hand in hand. We all know this as part of our culture coming down through generations, and I think that whole sort of culture of hunting and taking trophies and is something that has come down through history because we've been influenced by the Nephilim and their gods and their culture. We just don't know that we've been influenced to that degree.
Right. Interesting that you bring up Nimrod, who has sometimes been tied in as being connected to Gilgamesh, and the story of Gilgamesh, which of course goes back thousands of years, like 5,000, whatever. Anyway, he had a companion that used to go on adventures and fight monsters with him named Enkidu, who was pretty much described as a Bigfoot. Whoa, what's up with that? Tell us, Gary.
Yeah, a number of things, and that you've just opened Pandora's box, to use a Greek metaphor on this one.
I'm good at that.
Yeah. So let's first of all say, let's not compare Nimrod with Gilgamesh. I think Gilgamesh is about sixth generation as you rebuild the Sumerian genealogy, and Murakar of Eridu would be more equivalent to Nimrod. But Nimrod was a mighty hunter. He is said to become a Gibberim, or a mighty one, which can describe a giant, but not necessarily. We also know he's the son of Cush, so he may not be a Nephilim, but something happens to him, and he's closely also associated with the Babel rebellion. But Gilgamesh is the interesting character. And so this interesting character has a friend named Enkidu, and of course, both of these are described as 2/3 God and 1/3 human. And of course, within the epic of Gilgamesh, you have the flood narrative, which is very similar to the Genesis Noah narrative on the flood, on the macro details, but not on the micro details. Because again, Upnapishtim or Ziusudra, depending on which translation you're going to understand that from, is also 2/3 God and 1/3 human, and the absolute archetypical Nephilim to start the world thereafter. And his whole family is also Nephilim of the same description. And of course, Enkidu or Enkidu, depending on which translation that you're going to use on that, and Gilgamesh are created after the flood. So you have a second incursion creation of Nephilim, and you have an ark survival story of Nephilim, which makes it very interesting. And both Gilgamesh and Enkidu are described as very hairy individuals. Now, what's interesting about that is that we have this as a traditional description, one of the descriptions of Nephilim, which makes sense because these guys are Nephilim by the looks of it, or at least a Nephilim type of creation. And as Anunnaki, that would be, to me, a Nephilim. And so we also have in the Bible one particular race of Nephilim that's after the flood, that's called the Horites in some translations, or if you take that back to Hebrew, it's the Horim. And these are very, very hairy Nephilim. And Esau is going to actually marry in with this. Who is one of the sons of Isaac, and who loses the Messianic blessing and the birthright blessing and everything associated that goes to Jacob and then down through Israel in the Bible. But he's also a hairy and a hunter who's going to intermarry with this, and his son Eliphaz is going to marry Timnah from the Horim as well and produce Alamech, which produces the Amalekim hybrids from the Amalekim Nephilim. But the big thing is the Horim, the Hori, as you take that back, we're hairy and we're cave dwellers, which again gets into kind of a connection into the Bigfoot or the Sasquatch connections. And so, yeah, you have this going on. And you say, does that now make a connection to Bigfoot? Perhaps, but I think a different kind of creation, but related in the same type of sourcing.
Well, again, let's double back again now. So, do you think Bigfoot are pre-Adamites, or do you think that they're actually a subsidiary or related race to the Nephilim?
It could be either, but I would look at it from, I would lean towards being a creation similar to the Nephilim. And that would mean in the same sort of area. It could be before. I think they are pre-flood. I think most of these beings somehow survived the flood, and there's lots of ways for doing that. And I think
subterranean and you're living underground. Well, you can
that is definitely one of the ways. So with some sort of help, they're going to be able to do that, right? Either underground or on arcs or off world, just as you have Amaka Seth, which is again a giant type of being and another type of giant race that comes out of the tablets of Seth and other Gnostic texts and Gnostic Gospels, who is actually taken in a cloud and off Earth and protected, and then comes back at Sodom and Gomorrah after the flood to begin again the new sort of second incursion of creation of giants. So I'm open to both aspects of that, that somehow they survived the flood or that they were recreated again after the flood, because again we get accounts where you get these types of beings more closely associated with Bigfoot or Sasquatch after the flood as well. So I'm open to both.
Well, interestingly, I've done a bunch of research on this from the standpoint of the Native Americans, and one of my friends is Navajo, and he was telling me that according to their legend, and this would be backed up by just about all the other Native American folklore and their history on the whole thing, that the Bigfoot were here before the natives showed up. But they go one step further and say the Bigfoot were here before the giants showed up. So that kind of makes me wonder what, if anything, the giants actually had to do with them. I mean, maybe that's why I lean more toward, I think probably they're just pre-Adamites. Some of the giants may have survived by going underground. We know that they go underground. They made undergrounds. If they're underground, the Bigfoot were already around here. Well, you're my servant because I'm way bigger than you. You're doing my dirty work. Now I got a house underground. You're my slave in my house underground. There was a big flood. Well, my slave survived it too. Yeah,
and so when you look at from those accounts, that makes again perfect sense, because again you've got with giants a migration seemingly to North America, likely out of the Middle East, and certainly some of the research that's going on now with the red-headed skulls out of South America, and some of the excavations in North America, they tend to have a DNA that sort of maybe goes back to the Scythia region, which is another sort of giant sort of epicenter after the flood and before the flood that has a lot of connections. And the other thing I would be very much open to is just as you have Bigfoot, that is a significant part of Native American religion and history, they also have and seemingly an association with the little people.
Especially in this area, Gary. It's real obvious out here. They're way more scared of the little people than they are of Bigfoot, which you wouldn't expect, but they are.
Because of the technology that they have. And again, what most people don't know is the little people, and they're not in the Bible, but neither is Bigfoot that we can directly point to, but they're in all cultures and all religions and histories and mythologies around the world, and they have the same groups. They have different names for the same beings, but you've got good-looking ones, and you have the mischievous ones, and then you have the ugly ones, and they all have their own particular role to play. And the ugly ones, whether or not we're going to call them gnomes or whatever, they tend to deal in the technology aspect and the genealogy aspect. And what's important, where I'm going with all of this, is that they're closely associated with portals all around the world. Just as you might see and people may not recognize it for what the meaning of it is. It's called a fairy dolmen around the world, and it's like a mini sort of Stonehenge sort of structure. And these are portals. And dolmen, when you translate that, actually means portals. And so what I've learned, and I certainly haven't seen this or anything like that, this is just what I've learned in terms of the research, is that not only do the little people come through these portals, or the fairy mounds or the fairy shays as you get into more of the Celtic culture, but so does the Bigfoot, and that's why they sort of disappear. Now, I've also seen research, and again, I haven't been able to prove this, and your people would know way more about this than me, but there's also an association of caves with these portals, which again is that association with Bigfoot, and that these Bigfoot people are also known as, in other mythologies around the world, as the forest dwellers, just as many of the little people are considered forest dwellers as well. So you get this sort of association. So I'm not sure how that matches up with what your research and your people are telling you, but that's kind of what I've come across.
Yeah, that matches up pretty well, as a matter of fact. It makes good sense to me. The one thing that you brought up, which lead us in a direction to another question I wanted to ask you, you brought up South America, Peru. Paracas skulls, which brings me to L.A. Marzulli, who apparently thinks that they are the long necks, the Anakim. And also then that takes you to the latest big thing that's going on with Antarctica, where you've got David Wilcock and Corey Good. And Corey Good is saying that they were finding these Paracas skull guys frozen underneath the ice down there in Antarctica, and some of their old civilization and whatnot. What do you make of that?
And so you're saying they're finding some...
Well, Corey is claiming that they found the remnants of the civilization underneath the ice there, and they're finding, flash frozen mammoths and some of these, huge Paracas skull guys, which... if you look at the Paracas skull guys, that kind of skull looks exactly the same as like Akhenaten and his son Tutankhamun.
Yeah. If anybody wants to look like what a hybrid diluted bloodline looks like, and Akhenaten, depending on where you want to put his chronology, is 1200 to 1400 BC. Go to a King Tut museum and go see that Akhenaten sculpture, and it's got that elongated head, and it's got high cheekbones and the protruding chin and the slanted eyes, which is another connection, is that their eyes were thought to glow with the Nephilim, just as you've got different colored of glowing eyes with the Bigfoot. But he definitely has a serpentine look when you look at him from the side and the front in person. And so I don't know what's going on in South America, in not South America, but Antarctica. There is all sorts of speculation and all sorts of reports coming out. What we do know is there's a steady stream of very high level people from all around the world that are going there. So whatever they're seeing, whatever is going to come out is going to change a lot of preconceived conceptions. What exactly it is, I've heard it range from, secret alien bases to waking Nephilim to giant pyramids and all sorts of different things. And it's really tough to know what's going to come out of that, but something to keep an eye on, because it could have a big impact in terms of how people perceive this world, which I think is probably going to happen in some sort of way, and it could be related to Antarctica. As far as what L.A. Marzulli is doing and related to the Anakim, they could be. We don't know that, although the DNA is taking it back to Scythia, as opposed to right to where the Anakim were. We're right in the Covenant land and into the south towards to Saudi Arabia. And Anakim are just a branch name of the Rephaim. You get a lot of these giant names in the Bible. People just don't recognize them as giant names, like the Zamzuzim and the Emim and the Hivim and the Avim, and I won't go and list them all off, but you kind of get the idea.
I've actually done that in a previous show, Gary. The important point here is that pretty much anything that ends in IM, they're related to the giant.
Yeah, you got to be concerned with, and that's why Seraphim as their fathers is an important connection for these particular kinds of giants. And so when I look at what LA is though doing with the red hair elongated skulls, is that that fits well again in terms of what the mythology is on these Mediterranean giants. And in that mythology, whether or not it's in the Greek and Atlantean mythology, or it's in the Tuatha De Danann mythology, which comes again from Scythia, but has a branch that goes up into Norway and Sweden, and the other one is into the Celts, or in much of the Aztec and Central American history and mythology, is they both kind of say that there was two distinct kinds from this island location, which most people think or conclude is Atlantis. And one variety has blonde hair and blue eyes, which is the Aryan variety that most people would be familiar with. And the other one is red hair and hazel eyes. And of course, they all had pale skin and their eyes shone. So they were a complete assault on the senses, just as they smelled like sulfur or some sort of burning garbage. Anyways, just an awful smell. So I mean, they were an assault on your eyes in terms of what they looked like, in terms of your smell, and the voices that they could bellow, like is described in Greek mythology, like Atlas could, who is also a hero and a Nephilim as well in the Atlantean Greek mythology. So I can't take them back to the Anakim, except that in this polytheist version of giants showing up after the flood, they show up in Scythia and they go south into the Covenant land and north and northeast and northwest, and that's where the migration theory comes from, of these red-headed ones, perhaps coming from Ireland and the Tuatha De Danann, which is the same genealogical source, went to North America and went to South America.
It's interesting that the part of what the tribes say here in North America seems to back that up 100%, because they have, some of them have specific names of specific giants that they still remember, and they've got descriptions of these giants. Yeitzo, who like to bully around and eat the Navajo. And some of these other guys. And it's interesting how often that it comes up, well, what did they look like? Well, they had red hair and they had pale skin like white man. And that comes up over and over and over again.
I've not read of any accounts in North America that aren't red-headed and pale skinned, although when we get into Central America, you get some black African statues of possible giants, but those could also be pre-flood too, so it's hard to know. But generally, it's the red-headed variety, and the blonde-haired variety seems to be more into Central Europe and into Russia and into Sweden and areas like that.
So do you think the redhead gene in the humans is actually genetic passed down? Because it seems like redheaded people are a little bit kind of out there sometimes. And they've actually done some research on that, and there is scientific research to back up the fact that people with red hair have a worse temper and tend to go off more often. They've actually been able to verify that.
Yeah, I have tinges of red hair. I have very pale skin. I could attest to that.
I can't tell by your picture, Gary. It doesn't show much red hair.
Yeah, well, it was not totally red, but I have a lot of red hair in my family, but I had streaks of red hair that would shine in the sunlight. I come from genealogies from Scotland and Ireland, so and my brother asked me one time, he says, do you think we're Nephilim? I said, who knows and who cares, but
I would have said, I hope not, but
I hope not. Yeah, but yeah, I think there's a lot to that in terms of that sort of nature, and certainly in Ireland, you only really hear about the red hair and hazel eyes. And just sort of interesting tidbit is when we look at all of the vampire mythology that's out there today, and we look at Dracula, who is based on Vlad the Third, he is a noble Celt, as he goes back, and his genealogy is also back to Scythia as well, taking those genealogies on the way back, just as Prince Charles says he's a descendant of Vlad III, by the way. But anyways, this guy had pale skin, hazel eyes, red hair, was educated at the mystery school in Vienna of Sullivan, and this is who Dracula is based on, is the same type of description, and the blood drinking is a very typical Nephilim description. And it's thought that the Nephilim were drinking and taking the blood of humans, and they call it starfire or vril in that sort of mythos, to either extend their lives, that they had lost their immortality, and also to gain stronger cognitive advantage. And what's so important to understand about this is that this vampire allegory that has become a genre in itself is Dracula means son of a dragon. The A is son of Dracula, and Dracul is the dragon part. And again, we talked earlier about the Nephilim coming from seraphim angels, which are an angelic dragon as opposed to a physical dragon, when that's another interesting story in itself. And that the Nephilim were the offspring of these seraphim angels. And this is in allegory in terms of the purebloods of the Nephilim as they come down through history through the royal families. Dragon and raven is the allegory for the patriarchal bloodline, and fairy and owl is the allegory for the matriarchal bloodlines.
Interesting. Well, one thing about the Dracula, his father was the head of the Order of the Dragon, and the Order of the Dragon was charged with chiefly keeping the Muslims out of Europe. Let's not go any further with that one. But that's sort of why he had huge fights with the Ottoman Turks and sort of lured them into his territory so he could hand them their own butts and chase them back out again.
He was a very venerated bloodline of kings, and the son was actually inducted into the Sarkani Rond, or the Ordo Draconis, that was formed to retake the European kingships and put their bloodlines back on, and to, as you say, the greater defense of Europe from the Muslims.
Yeah, he was trying to get the king of Hungary to back him, to actually give him some military aid to help fight the Muslims, and he went, no, I don't want to get embroiled in this. I got problems of my own. And so they sort of left him out to dry. And actually, the king imprisoned him for a couple of years before he put him back on the throne again. But, it's really interesting that, to go back to the L.A. Marzulli thing, I think where he came up with Anakim, if I remember this correctly, is he was talking about, he had shown the red-haired, elongated skull, what would you call it, the conehead guy, to an anatomist, and her comment on what was, with this insertion point in the skull and the shape of the skull, this individual would have had to have an extremely long neck. And then he went, bing, oh, Anakim. That means long neck.
Yep. Well, and all of the Rephaim after the flood, and they all go back to the Rephaim after the flood, have particular descriptions for that name. So Rephaim, it has a few different meanings as you take that back to Hebrew, but that's going to be like the spirits of the deceased. And then that's because it's believed that the spirit of a Nephilim spirit doesn't die when the body dies, and it's not allowed into heaven, and it roams the earth as a demon until
Yeah,
the time of judgment,
That's what
right?
my former guest Dave believed too, and he was, like I said, he was an exorcist. He got rid of these things.
Yeah, but
and that's
Anakim,
exactly what they thought they were. They were demon spirits left over from the Nephilim that are still walking around causing trouble.
And that's exactly what Enoch says. And I have a document if somebody wants to look at a biblical case for demons and linking them back. I have that all as a biblically based document for people if somebody wants to get a hold of me on that. And the Anakim in the book of Deuteronomy are called Rephaim. And all of those are taken back to the root name Rephaim, just as Og was Rephaim. And you also get Genesis 14 as a Rephaim nation that's part of the War of Giants. And so even though it seems like Anakim and Avim and all these other names were vernacular names for the Rephaim. So certainly
like
Anakim.
Tribes or certain types.
Yes, yes. But all of them are believed to have long necks, is where I'm going. So again, when you see, in terms of these giants. And so when you see these reliefs and these pictures of the Egyptian ones or wherever, they all tend to have a little bit longer neck.
Right. Well, I think the other tie-in there is you look at the long skull and they say, well, it's the long necks, and then you look at the picture of like Akhenaten, and then those guys go, well, they got those same weird skulls and they got the long necks too. They do. And a lot of people say, well, anybody can create a elongated skull. You just have to wrap and bind the heads from birth. That doesn't increase the interior capacity of the skull. And exactly. These things have a big interior capacity, a lot larger than human. Yep.
Binding will not increase the cranial capacity. And the second thing you can't do is get rid of the human sutures, right? So these elongated skulls don't have those same sutures.
Right. A third thing that LA brought up that most people don't mention is the insertion point where the spinal cord actually went into the skull is in the wrong place. And how do you modify that with mortarboard?
Yeah. And so Josephus, when he described these beings, and he actually describes these bones still being on display in his time, and he grew up in the time of Jesus and part of the Roman diaspora, and he's actually captured by the Romans, and he writes the history. But he said these bones and the anatomical structure was completely different than that of humans, and that people would come to see these bones because they were just amazed by the size and the differences.
Wow. Now, another thing that comes to mind, and I talked to Dave about this quite a bit, and he was sort of interested in the whole thing, that according to him now, in the post-flood narrative, the word Nephilim doesn't actually come up. The giants are referred all as Rephaim after the flood. And he did some research on that specific word, and he thought it sort of carried less of a connotation of them being risen, as more of a connotation of them being risen from the dead, undead, basically.
Yeah, interesting. Just a bit of a correction. Nephilim does show up after the flood. Okay. Nephilim only shows up 3 times in the original Hebrew, once in Genesis 6:1-4, and then 2 times in the same verse in Numbers 13:33. Now, he is correct, and I agree on the idea that Nephilim aren't after the flood, but it's replaced by these Rephaim characters for a couple of reasons. So here's the reasons why. One is that the Anakim, who are described as the descendants of Nephilim in Numbers 13:33, and Nephilim goes back to the giants go back to Nephilim in that passage in the King James Version, and it does show up there twice. But we also know in Deuteronomy, as I mentioned earlier, that the Anakim are considered Rephaim. Mm-hmm. Now, this reference to Nephilim that's twice is in the evil report that is being given by the spies who don't want to go into the covenant land and take the land because they've seen Anakim there, and they say they're the descendants of the giants. Now, there's a few other exaggerations and lies that are in that report designed for people not to want to go in, which they didn't. They were so afraid. So it's not that the report that's listed before didn't say there were Anakim there, and it's not that Deuteronomy 1 doesn't restate that there was Anakim there. It's just that the idea that we have to be careful of is that because they were called the descendants of Nephilim may not be accurate. It could be an exaggeration, but it does show up. But Deuteronomy is very, very clear that the Anakim were called Rephaim. Now, for the Rephaim showing up after the flood, and because of the spirits, I mean, one might think that the demons could take the bodies of humans to possess, which demons do, but that's never a symbiotic relationship. The only symbiotic relationships we see in that is the avatar effect. That's where, like, the god Vishnu would be an incarnation into Nirashima, for example, or into Buddha, the 4th and 10th incarnations. But that's a symbiotic relationship. It doesn't sort of tear the person apart. So I'm not convinced that these are the original Nephilim spirits creating these giants, because, again, if they're just going into a human, then they probably wouldn't be a giant. So I tend to lean on, my favorite position is there is a second incursion either at Mount Hermon or at Sodom and Gomorrah that recreates these giants. They're not created immortal and in the same size as what is created in Genesis 6, but we do find these giants showing up after the flood. So they either survived or they're recreated. I just lean on recreation because it fits so much more with what the Bible is suggesting. But we don't know. That's the bottom line, right? We don't exactly know because we don't have a smoking gun as to a verse that says they were created after the flood like they were in Genesis 6, except that there's the wording in Genesis 6:1-4, it says that they were created at that time and then afterwards, and we don't know when afterwards is. Could be several creations of giants before the flood, or again, they were created after the flood as an explanation, but it's not crystal clear that we can take that to the bank.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, he was sort of the opinion that there was the pre-flood Nephilim and the post-flood Rephaim could at least be differentiated by size differences, because it seems pretty clear by the text that the ones before the flood tended to be quite a bit larger than the ones after the flood, wherever they came from.
I do agree with that. So with this second incursion idea is that they weren't able to pass on the immortal spirit and not able to create quite as large ones, even though they were still giants. And then if you get into the Ugaritic texts, you have references to the Rephaim, and there's also an ancient site called the Gilga Rephaim, or the Wheel of the Rephaim, or the Wheel of the spirits of the Nephilim. And in Ugaritic texts, it talks about these Rephaim people who can go between different worlds in a spiritual sort of sense, and they cross back and over. And we don't really get an explanation as to what that really means, other than they're spirits that can cross through different worlds, and they're called Rephaim. And that is likely a pre-flood site, although a lot of people argue that it is also post-flood, but seems to me it seems to be a little bit more ancient than that. And we get connections. One connection in the Bible in Ezekiel 38, where it's talking about the mighty ones, which goes back to Gibborim, who. I'm trying to remember the exact wording on it, but the understanding here, and Mike Heiser explains it quite well, is that these mighty ones are the ones, as it's talked about in the King James Bible, are the ones that cross over. And that's another connection back to, is this mighty ones or Gibborim talking about the Rephaim, and is that connected to the Rephaim that are mentioned in the Ugaritic texts?
Interesting. One thing you mentioned earlier about the dolmens and the connection to the fairies, we also have the fairy mounds and all that sort of stuff, connections to the fairies. But the thing that I find in my line of research is that the same sort of thing applies as a connection to the giants, because almost every place on Earth that you find megaliths, you ask the people there who made these, they say, well, the giants built them before we got here. And the same thing seems to apply to most of the dolmens. They've all got legends. It's like, yeah, well, the giants had something to do with it. So there seems to be this connection of the little people and the giants to these things. And just as an interesting side note, the largest dolmen on Earth is right here in Montana. The Tizer Dolmen's 60 feet tall at the Giants playground near the capital, Helena.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
Yeah,
and
why would it be here in Montana? Like there was a whole lot of megalith builders here? No.
Exactly. Or you get the walkway of the giants in Ireland, and at least you understand that there is a rich history of those giants there, and they're building megaliths over there. But I like that connection about the fairies because, again, with these different types of little people, they seem to be part of the same sort of culture before the flood in all these different civilizations that were there. And they all, as I said, specific roles to play, just as a dwarf would be one of the ones that would make the weapons and utensils, and the gnomes
protect nature, and et cetera, et
yeah,
cetera.
yeah. So they all created, and they all tend to have this connection back to being created by the gods who mated with somebody. But these ones, I mean, they're created small. So I looked at these are more of a people that's created more through DNA manipulation than what maybe the Nephilim were.
Yeah.
Because and again they don't have the same look, but we also get other interesting beings like the centaurs. That's half man and half horse, right? And
chimeras,
and chimeras, and created in centaurs created in a cloud, as if it's a DNA manipulation. And you also have Pegasus, and you also have mermaids, and then you get into things like what gods like Bast did out of the Egyptian pantheon, which that movie Panther is based on, and Bast is a lion god. And of course, you have lion men of Moab as Nephilim, and lion men of Gad, and you've got all of these other different sort of lion men that are on reliefs that are all around the world, and they were a warrior class and fighting just like the Nephilim were, and they had lion characteristics. And then you have the Tengu offspring of the gods that have this raven or bird face.